1 Corinthians in chapter 13. In 2013, there was a couple in Northern California. They were walking their dog in this large and rural property, and then something caught their eye. It was a large, rusty can. Now, that may not have been a big deal, really, just a large, rusty can, but they began to pry it out of the ground. And the couple was amazed to find when they opened it, it contained coins, gold coins, and they ended up getting about 1,427 gold coins, all dated 1847 to 1894. So they realized that somebody had at some point there in the late 1800s decided to hide that gold away and keep it hidden and then come back later. And of course, they never did. So there was millions and millions of dollars worth that they found just happening upon it walking with their dog. Of course, a lot of people, when they read that story years ago, they really came to the place where, man, I think metal detectors began to really get purchased quite a bit. Right after that. Of course, people have been doing that for years, looking for gold and looking for things and using metal detectors to find hidden treasure. I really want to talk about this morning, and this is a very familiar passage, but I think that we need to be reminded of this. We do not need to forget about. This is a wonderful passage we know in 1 Corinthians 13. And I think it's very easy to do, though, at times for believers. Of course, Paul is writing to believers. And the Corinth believers, they kind of put a lot of stock in the gifts and abilities they had. This is kind of why when you read about the church in Corinth, they also got to the place where they were kind of questioning Paul, whether Paul really, was just up to snuff, I guess, in one sense. Whether Paul had he didn't really have the credentials that some of the other ones that had came in and tried to deceive them and lead them away from the gospel had. Others came in and they said, boy, these are our credentials. And we've went to this schooling and we've learned this and we know all there is to know. And so the Church of Corinth was easily swayed. They were very much, there was a lot of factions going on too. Some said they were following Apollos' teaching. Others said they were following Paul's teaching. Others said, there were different ones that they were following. And so there were a lot of factions. And Paul wrote to them and said, was I crucified for you? Was it me that gave my blood? Was it Apollos that did these things? It's only Jesus Christ. It's only by his sacrifice. And that's it. Boy, we can get into those divisions. And of course, we got denominations of the wazoo here in America. I don't really put much stock in that. All my question is what do you believe about the Bible and the Word of God and Jesus Christ? Amen. That's it. And so again, we notice here, though, Paul reminds them something very important. Because the church at Corinth they were banking on speaking in tongues. There were a lot of people. That's where they got to. They got to the place where they were speaking in tongues, and there was a gift of tongues. We know there was a time and a place and a purpose for that. But again, Paul would have to remind them and tell them, speaking in tongues, even in that, you have to have an interpreter. You have to have somebody. If you're just spouting off mess and no one has a clue, there's confusion. And God is not the author of confusion. He's not the author of confusion. And so Paul will tell them even in that, yes, he says here in chapter 12 and verse 31, or in verse 30, have all the gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But covet earnestly the best gifts. So he does tell them you ought to seek to cultivate. You ought to seek to desire some of the best gifts and graces. God has given each one of us different abilities, different gifts. The measure of his grace and what he's given. There are things and abilities God's given to me that you may not have, but there's abilities and gifts God's given to you that I may not have. But again, we're all called to follow and to serve and to use what has been given to us. But Paul says here, he tells them to covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet I show unto you a more excellent way. And the idea here is that I'm going to show you something that's far greater, far superior, far better. So we're going to talk about the treasure. That treasure, by the way, it's not hidden. I mean, the treasures are there. The greatest treasure we see is God's love. God's love. And I think we just miss it so many times. You know, think about how many people probably did go buy that old rusty can and really didn't give much thought about it. Again, this is a treasure I think that the church, by and large, is missing out on hugely. And again, when Paul talks about love, he is describing God's love, not the love that the world describes. That type of love, that's not really even love at all. It's feelings, it's emotions, maybe some empathy, it's lust. It's a corrupted, tainted kind of love. But God's love is pure. God's love is wholesome. God's love goes far beyond anyone can imagine. And so we see here in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, he says, I may speak and have an ability and a gift to be able to speak different languages. I may have the ability to speak the language of heaven, the language of the angels. But I have not, and that word there, charity, old English, but it really is agape, and it is love, the description there. In fact, agape, it's translated love in Romans 5:8 when it says God commends his love toward us. So I don't know really why the translators put charity here. We when we think about charity, we think about benevolence, we think about giving. Well, that's included in that, but this is love. So when you read this passage here, understand it's not necessarily charity as you think of. It is love, and it is agape, God's love. But he says here that even if I have these gifts and abilities and can speak in such a way, and again, he's telling them off in a sense because they were focused on that. They were, well, I can do this. Oh, I can sing so well. Oh, I can speak in tongues. Well, I can speak in tongues more than you can. And Paul says, I have something far greater and far better that you ought to seek. He says, and if I do not have love, I become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Now, the idea here is it's a clanging instrument. It's just simply you have all the noise in your life, but no music. You understand? That's what he's saying. Without love, you're noise, but you have no music. And there's a lot of people, boy, they got a lot of noise in their life. Well, I meet a lot of ones. A lot of Christians. They're all noise, but they have no music. No music. Well, see, love makes the difference. My children, when they were toddlers, well, I think back to when they would sit there and go through, each one of them did this. They'd go through the cabinet and they'd pull out pots and pans. And boy, they just start beating on them. And then they just, and you know, to anybody else, it is just noise. It's, you know, people are going to cover their ears and everything. But I'm telling you, that was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. Love makes a difference, by the way. Well, I'd love to hear that again. Not now. You know, they're a little older, and it's a little different. You know, if they go back in there and start beating pots and pans now, well, somebody might get in trouble. So anyway, but we do know here there is this, with love, it makes it music. It changes things. And Paul is saying that I can have these gifts. You can have all of this, but it's just noise. You think you're doing something, but you're doing nothing. In fact, he goes on, he says, and though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries. Again, he says it may be noise, but there's no music. It's God's love that makes the music. It's God's love that brings it all together and gives it that harmony and that rhythm. And of course, verse 2, he says, though I have the gift of prophecy and I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have faith, all faith. Now you notice that here. Why? He says I could have the gift of prophesying and interpreting the divine will. I can understand mysteries. That was something big, and it's still big when they talk about and describe this secret knowledge. Of course, there's some groups that meet, and I think about Masons and different ones, and they talk about, as the higher you go, they talk about this secret knowledge, which is just ridiculous too. Because again, it is not secret. God has revealed. It's the good news of the gospel. God's not hiding that. But again, Paul says, I can understand all mysteries. I can understand all these secret things and all knowledge. I can have all knowledge and understanding. And even though I have all faith, this type of miraculous faith that everyone looks at, increase our faith. Oh, I wish I had their faith. Oh, if I had this type of faith, think what I could do. Paul said, even if I had all faith, so that I could remove mountains. And that is from where Jesus talked about having faith the size of a grain of a mustard seed. It's where it's planted, by the way, the true faith. Not just simply whether you have faith. Who do you have it in? Who do you have it in? It has to be rooted in Jesus Christ. But again, we see here, he says, even if I have faith that I can remove mountains and have no love, I am nothing. I'm useless. The idea here is a useless nobody. A useless nobody. When I grew up, my life, I had a lot of low self-esteem and pity parties many times. Well, I'm no good. I'm not this. I'm not that. My mother would try to cheer me up and stuff, and I look back and I think, man, just how sad. Sometimes you want to go back to your younger self and just smack yourself a couple times, and just get a hold of yourself. But I did. I had a lot of low self-esteem, and that kind of, I would say in part, that was my father had left when I was younger, and we just, again, we had a lot of troubles growing up and things. But it's this idea, I'm a nobody. Well, the fact is that I am a nobody. I am a nobody. It's not about Josh. It's not about you. Really, Paul says, if you don't have God's love, you can have all the gifts, all the abilities, you can have all the faith. But it doesn't mean anything, and you are just a shell of a person. You're just a shell of a person. So you can have all abilities, but you're entirely hollow. You can make all the noise in the world, but it's no music. You can have all the abilities, but you're hollow inside. There's an emptiness there without God's love. Amen. So again, it does mean something here. I think about it like a house, but nobody's inside, nobody's living in it. It's a shame to watch some homes that, and when no one's there, they just go downhill quick. And so again, this idea, love makes all the difference. The love of God. He goes on to say, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profits me nothing. So again here, the idea, he says I can have the noise, but there's no music. I can have the abilities, but it's entirely hollow. And I can have sacrifice, but it profits nothing. All the sacrifice in the world that I give, it means nothing without the love of God. Well, of course, we look at that in Micah. In chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, it talks about what does the Lord require? Does he want all these sacrifices? Does he want, should I give the firstborn, the fruit of my loins to God? Should I give that over? Should I give thousands of rams? What should I do? And of course, he says, you know what God requires. To walk humbly with your Lord, to do justly, to love mercy. We already know what God requires. And so again, you can sacrifice all you want to, but there's no profit in it if it's not out of love. What is interesting here as you go on, notice he says, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, I could give. The idea, we oftentimes what me and Stephanie enjoy doing, we get up in the morning and we'll get a cup of coffee. And now it's not, everybody else, they may drink black coffee. No, I need a little bit of something in the coffee, So people say, that's that frilly coffee or whatever. That's that fancy coffee. Well, that's fine. I'll keep it fancy for a while. Maybe I'll get a little bit bitter later on in life more, and I'll drink black coffee. But anyway, so, but we'll sit there and drink coffee and we'll watch the birds. We got a bird feeder and we'll just watch them go. And the other day we were watching the birds and there was a cardinal that was just getting the seeds and there was a little baby bird. The cardinal was taking it and just kind of crumbling it up and bringing it over and putting it in the mouth of the baby bird, just going and taking it and just, you just watch that and you see it. And it's just a wonderful sight to see. And this is that wording here when Paul talks about I could bestow. In the Greek, the idea is like literally taking food and it's giving. It's not just simply setting it down and leaving, but you're feeding the person. You are going above and beyond. So it's more than just simply, I can just give them a little bit of food and I'm going to leave. You are nourishing the person. You're cherishing them. You're caring for them. You're doing all these things. And yet still, it doesn't profit anything if you don't have a heart of love when you do that. He says, I can bestow all my goods to feed the poor. And though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profits me nothing. Now that's interesting there. There's two different views about this. Some say that the translation itself really means Paul's talking about, well, I could try to glory in certain things. I think when he talks about here, when he's talking about giving his body to be burned, in that time, there were some. Now, quite interestingly, there were some people, they were actually enamored with Stephen's martyrdom and James's martyrdom, and they actually were seeking to become martyrs. Some of them believed that actually if they would be martyred for the cause of Christ, that would kind of absolve sins in their life, and it would kind of put them on a higher pedestal. Now, it sounds strange, it sounds weird, but there were some in that time as well that they viewed, hey, if I just give the ultimate sacrifice, if I give of myself. I think about years ago, I watched a movie called The Mission. And of course, there was a lot of Catholicism within the film. And in one of the ones at the beginning of the film, they had killed a friend, and they bore this weight on them. And so later on in life, when they met a monk, they were told, to basically pay penance, he was supposed to wear this heavy weight on his back and carry that for miles and miles uphill up a mountain. And of course, that was the idea. And so some that were following him said, hey, you've done enough. It's too much now. You hurt yourself too much. And he said, no, I've got to keep going. And this idea here of harming himself, hurting himself, so that way, he could get absolvance. Well, I think when Jesus said it is finished, he meant it. But there were some, they did seek out to be martyrs. Again, it's not that you shy away from that. But there were some that they just were asking. They were looking and thinking, boy, and sadly some, even had this view. I don't think at that time you had this idea of sainthood. We're all saints in Jesus Christ. But again, there was something later on, that was the idea is, well, I want to be a saint. I'm going to give of my life. And so Paul says, you could do that. But if you don't do it out of a heart of love, guess what? You've given nothing. It profits nothing. It's to no avail. And so again, it is so imperative when it comes to love. We think about, remember, Jesus pointed out the widow woman. And remember, all of the Pharisees, all of the scribes, different ones, they're giving in a lot of money. And everybody's looking and saying, wow, look how much they gave. Look how much they did. And Jesus knew their heart, and he knew the motive. Most of the time, it was so that everyone else could look at him and say, what a wonderful, wonderful person of God. What a man of God. Look how much they're giving. And then a widow comes and gives not even a day's wages. That's all she had. And she gives. And what does Jesus do? He points it out. You know why? Because she gave. They all gave out of pretense. They all gave out of a motive to be puffed up and for everybody to look at them as something grand and great. But Jesus saw the motive of her heart, and Jesus said she gave even of her own living. She gave all that she had, and I believe she gave out of a heart of love in that. Jesus saw that. That's what makes the difference in all of it. So then Paul goes on here to describe love. And we'll go through this quickly here. But we notice he says in verse 4, love suffers long and is kind. Love is long-suffering. Love is long-suffering. Love envies not. Love is content. Love is content. You're not seeking others. You're not looking and saying, well, I want that. Well, I wish I was mine. Love, God's love says, I'm content with what God has given to me. Love vaunteth not itself. The idea here is it's not boastful. It doesn't display itself haughtily. It's not puffed up. In Proverbs, it teaches that everyone will proclaim, in Proverbs 20, verse 6, most men will proclaim his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find? Again, we can sit there and exaggerate, and we can talk about all these great endeavors that we've done. When I was in South Carolina, the preacher that was there, I was associate youth pastor, but he had a really beautiful bass hanging up in his office. And people would come in and they'd see the preacher and they'd talk with him, and there were times they'd look and say, that's a beautiful fish. And I said, man, I can't believe that, and inevitably people would say, where did you catch that? And he'd say, you had to ask that, didn't you? Because he didn't catch it at all. He didn't catch it at all. Just given to him. Somebody had handed it to him, and he put it on the wall. He enjoyed when people would say, they never asked him, but they'd say, wow, look at that. That is amazing. And he enjoyed it. But once they asked him, wait a minute, where'd you catch it? It bothered him. Well, I think, again, for us, many times we like to boast. We like to exaggerate. We like to be praised. But true love doesn't display itself haughtily. It doesn't boast of itself. It is not seeking the limelight. It's not concerned with being the top dog. And then we see in verse 5, it does not behave itself unseemly. The idea here is it's not conceited. It conducts itself in a proper manner. It acts respectable. There's no perversion within love. And of course, we live in this society, there's so much perversion, so much distortion and confusion. But here it says it's not going to be rude. It's not going to be arrogant, inflated, and conceited. And it doesn't act unbecomingly. And then we notice it's not easily provoked. Not easily provoked. So again, here in this, it doesn't insist. In the terminology here, it doesn't insist in its own rights, its own way. It's my way or the highway. Love doesn't do that. What I say goes. Love doesn't do that. Love, he goes on, it thinks no evil. It thinks no evil. And again in here, it's the idea in this is that there's no jealousy and animosity in seeking vengeance. Vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Love does not rejoice in iniquity. It doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness. This is why I say it's entirely different than the world's love. Oh, love is love. Love whoever you want. Oh, God's love, it doesn't rejoice in sin. It doesn't rejoice in iniquity. That's how there's sadly so many that claim to be Christian. And they claim to have God's love, but I know they don't. Because if they did, they'd realize that God's love is not going to lead them into a life of sin. But it's going to bring them into righteousness and into God's truth. So again, we go on, it says here, Paul goes on to say, it does not rejoice in iniquity, but it rejoices in the truth. It rejoices in what is right and what is true. Love bears all things. It bears up under anything, everything that comes. And it believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But whether there be prophecies, they will fail. Whether there be tongues, they will cease. Whether there be knowledge, it will vanish away. All of these gifts, all of these abilities, again, that is going to be done away with. But the one thing that's left standing that means far beyond any of it and far superior is God's love. God's love. And we miss it so many times. Paul says, we know in part, we prophesy in part. When that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. And here the idea that he's talking about is we are growing. And we are growing now into this full maturity. But the sense of this is that it's not about gifts. It's not about just the abilities. You are going to grow, and how you grow is by the love of Jesus Christ. And we'll notice this here. Why? He goes on to say, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abides faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The greatest of these is love. Turn with me here to Romans 13. I'm just going to show you a few passages here and we'll be finished. Romans in chapter 13. Paul writes in chapter 13, and let's look here in verse 8. Romans 13 and verse 8. owe no man anything. I have tried my best to live that way. I've not tried to be in debt. Of course, we are paying on a home. I hate it when people say, oh, you bought a house. No. Did not buy a house, I'm buying it. Hopefully. But again, he says, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he that loves another has fulfilled the law. For this you will not commit adultery, you will not kill, you will not steal, you will not bear false witness, you will not covet. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this, saying, namely, you will love your neighbor as yourself. Love works no ill. It works no ill. It does no wrong to one's neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Again, we've been called. It's not about, we look at a list and we think to ourselves, God has this list laid out and we've got to follow that list. All God says is, love me with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the fact is, if you do those things, everything else is going to come together because love fulfills the law. Well, then I want you to notice even further here. Go to Colossians. Let's look here in Colossians in chapter 3. Colossians in chapter 3. Colossians in chapter 3, and let's notice here in verse 12. And we'll go to one final passage, and I want us to look here in Colossians 3 and verse 12. Paul says here, reminding the believers, we're buried with him in baptism, wherein also you are risen with him. Or this is chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 12. Sorry, I'm reading chapter 2. I'm sure that's a good passage as well. Verse 12, chapter 3. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering. By the way, all of these things, it's manifested through a heart of love. Paul says, put these things on in your life. Exercise these things. Seek to have kindness, mercy, humility, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. Be patient with one another. Forgive one another. Be gentle with one another. He says, if anyone has a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfectness. And what he's saying is it takes all of these Christian virtues and it knits it together in wonderful harmony. Love. So again, you may say, well, I'm merciful. Well, I give. Well, I'm faithful going to church. Well, I will tell people sometimes about Jesus. Well, I'll do this. But I'm telling you, you better make sure you have love. God's love in your heart. You better be growing in the love of God. Seeking to walk in the light of his love, because if you don't, and if all you do is follow a list and a formula, be careful, because there's nothing there but emptiness. There's nothing there. It's God's love that brings it together. It's important. It fulfills the law. It brings all those virtues, knits it together. And then turn with me here and we'll be finished. Look with me in Galatians in chapter 5. Galatians in chapter 5. Galatians in chapter 5. And let's notice beginning in verse 1. Paul says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. Be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you are circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Again, they were looking at, well, maybe we got to go to the works of the law. And he says, Christ will profit you nothing if you're following the law and not Christ and his love. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. If that's what you're going to abide by and follow, and you're not following Christ, and you've got to follow the entire law, and you can never measure up. Christ has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. You have walked away. You've severed yourself. You've separated yourself from Christ. If you're following the law, and you're looking at that to redeem you, and you're looking at your own righteousness, you are now pushing aside what Christ has done in the finished work. And he says you're going to fall from that grace. He says, for we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ, neither circumcision avails anything. There's no profit in that, nor uncircumcision, but faith. But notice this, which works by love. The word there, works, in the Greek, is where we get the word energize, energy. What gives faith the energy? What gives it that working and exercising? It is love. Love. And again, we may sit there and say, I wish I had faith. Oh, if I had that person's faith. But I'll tell you this, some of the ones that you're saying that about, you know why they have that kind of faith? Because they have a great love for God. And so maybe you don't need to sit there and say, I wish I had their faith. Probably you need to say, I don't love God like I should. And I don't have the love of God in my heart like I should. If you did, I tell you what it'd do. It energize your faith and it would do work in your life. Love is the foundation of that, God's love. Do we have it in our lives? What about it? Let's pray.